happy Monday. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I'm super excited because today we're going to start our next story. I had so much fun reading The One and Only Ivan. I only cried a few times. So I'm very excited to read this book. This book is very commonly read in third grade. It's very popular among third graders. And it's won an award, so it's just a really, really good book. It's called Because of Winn-Dixie, and it's about this cute little dog that we're going to learn about, and yeah, I'm excited. So there are, let's see, I think it's 26 chapters in this book. We're going to read 2 chapters a day, so it's going to take us 13 days to read this book. I like that there's chapters. The One and Only Ivan was kind of funky. It had just all these little sections, right? So 2 chapters a day. If you guys end up ordering this book, it'll be super easy to follow along because I'll just say this chapter, this chapter. But yeah, let's get started. I hope you guys had a good weekend. I think I may have said that. I don't remember, so if I didn't, it's Monday. I need more coffee. Okay, chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer, my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers, and there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly. He looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I'd never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him real concerned and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again, and then I figured that that dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came into my head, and I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." Now remember, this little girl is at the grocery store, and the name of this grocery store is called Winn-Dixie. So she just randomly said that to the dog. So that would be like us being in Walmart, being like, "Come here, Walmart," or we're at Fry's, the grocery store, right? And we were like, "Come here, Fry's." Like, it seemed funny, right? They're all like, "What?" That dog came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said, honest. The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful and he didn't look that good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess, isn't it funny?" It's hard to not immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach, and so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. "But you know what?" I told Winn-Dixie. "You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs, and I have to admit he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet, because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means that he's thinking hard. "Daddy," I said. He said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" he said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. "Daddy," I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while?" Finally, the preacher looked up at me. "Opal," he said, "what are you talking about?" "I found a dog," I told him, "and I want to keep him." "No dogs," the preacher said. "We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog." "I know it," I said. "I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look," I said, and I went to the trailer door and I hollered, "Winn-Dixie!" Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and he showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn-Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. "And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure." "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you found one." "Oh, How sweet is that? She goes to the grocery store, finds a doggy, and she convinces her daddy to let him stay. If I did that to my parents, I don't know that they would let me keep it up. So since today is Monday, Miss Duncan has thought up of this whole new plan, and every single day we're going to do a different subject. So I'll read a little bit of Because of Winn-Dixie every single day, and then the second part of our video will be a certain subject. So, of course, Monday is going to be Math Monday. Okay, so for our very first Math Monday, we're going to talk about a subject that is a little bit tricky. I've actually gotten several of you guys asking me about this, needing reminders and help. And so that's why I chose this for the first day, and it is borrowing. Borrowing is something that we do when we're subtracting, right? And it can get tricky and hard. So we're gonna go over it a little bit. I wonder if I bring this a little bit closer. So the first part of subtraction is pretty easy. This is gonna be a little rhyme that helps you remember. More on top, no need to stop. What do I mean by that? Well, if we think of normal subtraction, let's say we do 67 minus 42. If you look at this 7 and the 2, there's more on top, right? And even over here, there's more on top for the 6 and the 4. So there's no need to stop. This is normal subtraction. 7 minus 2 is 5. And 6 minus 4 is 2. Okay? What about 154 minus 21? More on top, right? Yep, so keep going. 4 minus 1 is 3. 5 and 2, more on top. Yep, keep going. 5 minus 2 is 3. More on top. Well, there's nothing here, which basically means this is a 0, right? So the answer is 1. Keep going. This is our normal subtraction. This is what all of you guys know how to do. You guys started learning that a long time before 3rd grade. Now, here's the second part of our little rhyme. And this is what gets tricky, but this will help you remember. More on the floor, go next door and get 10 more. What do I mean by that? Well, let's see. If we do 62 minus 17, if we look at this 2 and the 7, is there more on top, like up here, or is there more on the floor? There's more on the floor, right? 7 is much bigger than 2. You can't do 2 minus 7. So what we're going to do is we're going to go next door to this 6. Here's the 6. We went next door. And we're going to get 10 more. The reason why this works is because if we look at this 6, is it really a 6? It's a 60, right? Think about place value. So we're going to take from this 6 and we're going to make it a 5. And then we're going to bring 10 over here. Now that's going to be 12. We're just adding a 1 in front of the 2. But that 1 is really worth 10 because we're taking it from this 10's place. You kind of following? So now the 12 is on top and the 7 is on the bottom. Now we have more on top. So we don't need to stop. We can keep going. 12 minus 7 is, think about it here, 5. And then over here, 5 and 1. Do we have more on top? Yep. We can just keep going. 5 minus 1 is 4. So the answer to this one is 45. Now this works all the way up to the 3-digit numbers. Let's see, if we do 200, Miss Duncan's just making this up as she goes, and 12 minus 56. All right, 2 is on top, 6 is on the bottom. Is there more on top or more on the floor? There's more on the floor, so we need to go next door to this 1 and get 10 more. Whoa, this becomes a 0. We took all of that. And then this becomes our 12. Now we've got 12 and 6. There's more on top, no need to stop. So 12 minus 6 is 6. Now, can we do 0 minus 5? Oof, there is more on the floor, right? So we need to go next door to this 2, and we need to get more. This 2 is going to become a 1. And then we're going to take the other one and put it here. Now 10 minus 5 is 5. 1 minus nothing is 1. Now, if this is something that you guys have trouble with, I suggest getting out a notebook, a piece of paper, pencil, pen, whatever you guys have at home, and writing this down. More on top, no need to stop. More on the floor, go next door and get 10 more. Now, I was on Khan Academy looking at some of the problems, so that's where I want you guys to go. If this is something that you struggle with, I want you to just go practice on Khan Academy. Watch this video if you need to, if you need a reminder, but Khan Academy is a great place to start. Another trick is that you want to make sure that you are always lining up your numbers. You have to stay within these columns, because if you get them mixed up, especially once we get to 3-digit, 4-digit, 5-digit, if you accidentally put 2 here and 1 here, you're not going to get the right answer. So sometimes it's even easier to draw this line before you start. At least make sure you line it up. You can also use graph paper if you have any, especially when you're at school. Graph paper works good to make sure that your numbers are lined up, but that's really important. Always make sure you're lining up your numbers before you start a problem, and always make sure you're working your way from right to the left, okay? If we had subtracted 6 minus 1 first, we would have gotten a 5. That's not right. We would have gotten the answer wrong. So make sure you're always starting over here and you're working your way this way. That's really important. I will see you guys tomorrow on Tuesday. Hope to see you guys on Google Meet. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Bye.